So right now we're pulling the shock. We're gonna measure real wheel travel before we get the new arms on from LSK, and then we're gonna measure those and see what our numbers look like. So now what we're doing is we've already established our shock length, and what we did is we measured our shock length with it off the car and we got our static height. And what we're doing now is articulating the arm up and down throughout the suspension travel to actually see what our real world numbers are for both the stock arms, and once we put on this new LSK kit, what those numbers will translate to at the wheel.
Why are we removing the sway bar?
So the sway bar end link, actually the sway bar itself, is hitting the arm here. So as we're trying to get our suspension measurement, it's binding up on the sway bar. So rather than just disconnecting it, we're just gonna pull the whole thing. So to get these off, you gotta try to straighten this dimple out. Now what you could also do without beating it is just relief cut it and get a new nut on reassembly. You can use a Dremel, you can use a flathead or a grinder. Just be careful not to cut into the axle stub end.
Go ahead.
Voila.
Something weird.
Can't even feel it.
Here's the stock arm taken off. You don't reuse any of the caps or anything. You can see on the new arm, it comes with the bushings and everything, and new sleeves. So you just reuse the hardware.
Probably just easier to drop the skid. There we go. And then LSK sends these 3.5-inch extensions, which just thread on. A little Loctite on both ends would be great. And then once your car's on all fours, you can adjust toe and alignment and everything. But we're actually gonna pull these We're going to replace these with the billet Weller tie rods, which are also available on our website. Okay. Oh, 36 to 72. Nice.
Convenient. You have to slide the pin back in through the clevis and everything. Get the snap ring back into that groove right there.
What? The boot going on?
The boot, you have to remove the nut, and then you slide the boot over the threads, and then we'll get it back up on the shoulder of the rack. It'll be a little bit of work, but we'll get it.
So now that we have the axle assemblies together, with the knuckle off the arms, just gonna kind of feel the splines line up, and because the diff has a tapered female end, and you fight that that little spring circlip, just kind of pop it in, just like that, and then reassemble your knuckle with the axle now. So probably be easiest to get like a little jack to hold an arm up while you get everything situated. And then get your tie rod in and just loosely get all the nuts on these bolt ends. My chrome plated impact socket. So now we're going to go through and tighten upper, lower brake calipers, your uniball, your ball joint down there. And then once you get the car back on its own weight, you're going to want to go back and double check this lower ball joint. Get a little pressure, help seat it on that taper. So for the brake lines, we're going to take out the entire factory assembly. Now the easy way to do this is to leave the factory T-junction bolted in with this 10mm bolt and use a 10mm brake line wrench to break that compression nut loose. Now prepare yourself for a mess, get some rags ready, a drip pan underneath it, because there's really no way of getting around that. So you break this loose, and then you could disconnect the T-junction and put the new one in and tighten it back up, and it's gonna have tension the entire way. It's a tapered thread, so just be aware of that. And once it's all buttoned up, you can bolt the new T-junction in and run your brake lines out to the calipers, and make sure those are cranked down pretty snug as well. You have a copper washer on both sides of the brake line. Make sure those are intact when you go ahead and tighten everything up. All right, so for the rear, to remove this nut, we're gonna go ahead and give another relief cut to that indent, pry it back with the flatheads, and then take a 32mm nut on a 1/2 inch impact and back her off. So before you start getting any of the components off, you're gonna wanna pull your shocks and your sway bar off. So it's a 17mm bolt and a 19mm nut. We've already broken this one loose, so. And there she goes. And then up to the top two, it's a 17 and 19. And depending on the size of your impact, you might need to go manual. But looks like we can get it in there. And you should be able to just shimmy them out. I'll start at the bottom.
The jack over here, really.
And it's a little bit of a, there you go. Get past the exhaust here. There. So next you're going to pull your sway bar end links. We have the Weller links on ours, which is a 10mm Allen and a 17mm nut. If you have the factory setup, go ahead and remove those as well. A 17mm bolt with a 19mm nut. Top and bottom. Leave those in there for now. Then two 14mm bolts to remove the caliper from the rotor. Once the caliper is off the rotor, you're going to have 1, 2, 3 10mm bolts retaining the brake lines. You can use power tools. Last brake line retainer is right here. You won't be reusing any of this, so you can just grab and pull it right out. So now that everything's kind of ready to go, you're gonna take your hub assembly off. The knuckle's gonna wanna come with it, which is why we left these bolts in there. And then the axle is actually kind of holding everything together. So don't lose your thrust washer. So you'll also want to pull your rear skid, and when you're going to pull these axles out, now's a good time to check the level and the condition of your diff fluid. You're going to get a little coming out anyway, and now's a good time to fill that up and give it a little inspection. And there she comes. So I have a drip pan ready, not too much, and we'll go put this axle on the bench and get it ready to be rebuilt. So we're working through a rear axle disassembly, and unfortunately this axle is bent. And while we were breaking it down, we started to notice some heat marks here, which are pretty noticeable, which just tells us that there's something going on internally. Now, we already broke apart the inner CV, and unfortunately, we did notice some cracking here and here. Pretty rough spots in here. You can see the wear here too on the star, that the balls were sitting a little bit higher up instead of riding in the center where all that strength is. So unfortunately, this outer's trash, this inner's trash, and this outer's probably trash too. So we're gonna go get some new Demon axles on the rear of this car and go from there. So both axles on the rear of our shop car have a little damage, and as you'll see here, we can just roll them across the floor Yeah, so that's probably why the CVs were cooking so much, is putting all that unnecessary extra strain on the inners. And then we have, that one's also out just a little bit, nowhere near as bad, but again, we're gonna be using a Summer Brothers axle shaft for our spare and using the stock CV assemblies off of this one since it's nowhere near as bad. So next step is we're pulling the rear arm, 17 millimeter bolt with a 19 millimeter nut. Might need to coerce it out.
Nice trick. Trick of the trade. Trick of the trade part 2. Oh. Not trick of the trade.
So for the lower arm, you're gonna remove these 2 bolts here. This is a 14 millimeter bolt with a 19 millimeter nut. So when you're installing the lower arm, you're gonna have 4 misalignments, and it may be in one of these Heim ends, but you're gonna want the larger misalignments to go in the front Heim for this larger gap up here, and the smaller misalignments will go towards the rear of the car. So when you're reinstalling all of your new arms and you see your factory hardware, you can go ahead and clean that up with a little bit of Scotch-Brite or a little bit of steel wool. Then we just put a little Loctite on, or sorry, Loctite, NECs on there, and get that bolt ready, put aside to install into your rear Heims. And you may need a second pair of hands. Luckily, I got a cameraman here that has 2 of them. And these may need a little coercion. You know, it's a brand new Heim, so you might want to rock them and rack them a little bit, break them loose, get them lined up. And if you're noticing a little bit of a alignment issue on your car, you can always adjust this Heim to move it back and forward. And then you're going to fish this bolt right through, and go ahead and put your nuts and washers on both, and you can start on the uppers. Now your upper arm, and your long bolt. So just make sure your spring clip is seated, line your splines, and push it in. We lift our boots off because we still got some work to do on this car, but you could clamp those on or zip tie them on or whatever you want to do. So the rear knuckle goes on, bolt, on, and upper arm will go in. We're going to put a little bit of NECs on this bolt here. Nice liberal amount. And loosely reinstall both nuts, clean up the excess NECs, and we can move on to the next step. So clean up your surfaces here. Don't forget your thrust washer, and then your hub assembly can go on. washer and nut. And this nut, this 32 millimeter nut, gets torqued to 268 foot-pounds. Now, when you torque this, you're going to want to make sure that the indent lands in the axle indent as well. Now, since this is coming back apart, we are going to leave this nut on here, and we're not going to use any Loctite. The caliper's back on, and your shock is in. Now you can take your brake line and zip tie it to the arm out of the way of the shock body. And you want to do this at full droop, where it's going to be the tightest. So we're going to route it on the back side here, and that will be it. Once you have that aligned, you're going to want to get the car back on all fours and start aligning the rear arms.